Alright, we're ready to get started. So it's going to be 4 simple steps. Step 1, drain out the coolant. Step 2, remove the thermostat from the housing. Step 3, replace it with the new thermostat. And then step 4, refill the coolant that we drained out. Alright, so in terms of what you need to do this, there's actually not too much that you need. You're going to have to drain some coolant, so we have a drain pan there to catch that. You need a ratchet with a 10mm socket. You need the new thermostat. I prefer an OEM one. It was like 30 bucks. You got this little, you can use a funnel, or this is a pretty unique, it's a spill-proof funnel kit, so you can save coolant that you don't use. It just makes it a little bit easier to fill up the coolant. And maybe a set of pliers to remove some hose clamps, as well as pull out the thermostat from the housing. And you're also going to want to make sure you have some Honda Type 2 coolant to refill the radiator. So step 1 is going to be draining out all the coolant. So you're going to want to remove this radiator cap right here. Make sure you do this when the vehicle is completely cool. So if you've been driving for like a few hours, let the vehicle sit for at least a few hours before you remove this cap. Otherwise, like, hot coolant could fly up. So we're going to remove this cap, and you could just leave it sitting on top, kind of like this. You don't have to take it off all the way. Then we're going to go underneath the vehicle and drain out the coolant. So there's actually going to be, so you want to have your drain pan ready, sitting right there. There's actually going to be that white plug right there. You turn that counterclockwise to drain out all the coolant. Loosen that up real good, and then you'll notice the coolant starting to drip down. And you don't have to take it out all the way, you can kind of just leave it in there a little bit. And whenever you're working on your car, it's always good to go the extra mile. So you don't necessarily have to drain out all the coolant, but it would be a good idea, since we're already working on it, get as much of the old coolant out as possible and replace it with some fresh new coolant. Alright, so the coolant is pretty much fully drained out. We're just going to tighten up the white plug. Just get it nice and snug, that should be good. So just an overview of what we have to do to take out the old thermostat. You have this upper radiator hose. That's optional whether or not you want to remove it. I'm not going to, just because sometimes they get stuck on you and it's difficult to take out. The next step is going to be removing these two 10mm bolts. That just holds this bracket in. We're going to set that to the side. The housing is actually down in here. So you can see a hose that runs to the housing, and then there's going to be two 10mm bolts on that to pull it out, and the thermostat just sits right in there. Alright, now we have to remove these two 10mm bolts to remove this bracket so we can get some more access to the housing. So just get a 10mm on a ratchet and break those loose. And once they're broken loose, you can just remove them by hand and set them aside. So once those two bolts are out, this bracket will be free to move, so you can just maneuver it out of the way. So the bracket doesn't have too much give, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold it to the side. That gives us access to one of the 10mm bolts for this housing, and then once we remove that, there's just one more bolt on the other side, and then we can pull the housing out. So just hold the housing to the left side. It'll give you enough clearance to get a ratchet in there. And then we'll remove this 10mm bolt right there. And then we'll remove by hand. And then make sure you distinguish between the bolts. So the bolts for the housing are a little bit longer than the bolts for the bracket. So just separate those two out. Now the second bolt is more to the right side, so if you follow the radiator hose and you just look below that, it's going to be sitting right there. So this one's also 10mm, so we're just going to get a ratchet on there and remove it. Now there's not a lot of clearance since we didn't remove this, so what we're going to do is we have a 10mm on a 3-inch extension, and we're going to use that to rotate it out by hand. And then just do the last few rotations by hand so you don't lose the bolt. Good. Now there's nothing else holding in the housing, so we should be able to just pull towards us and it'll come off. And you can hear some coolant draining out. So I use the bottom of the housing where the hose is attached as leverage to pull it off. Move this bracket out to the left, pull that out, Alright, so I'll give you all a close-up view. So I simply use the hose that's attached to the bottom of the housing as leverage to pull it off. And in this case, the thermostat actually came out with the housing. Sometimes it'll be stuck on the inside right over there and we'll need to pull it out. In this case, we'll pull it out of the housing. Alright, got him. Alright, so we want to do a quick comparison, the old with the new. I bought this one direct from Honda, so I'm pretty sure it's an exact fit, but we could just double check that. And yes, everything looks good. If you buy an aftermarket one, you want to make sure it's pretty close, or if not identical to the old one. Now the one from Honda does not come with the gasket installed, so that's why we have this one as a reference point to install the new gasket. So 3 things to note when installing the new gasket. These 2 nubs must point inward to the longer side of the thermostat. 2, there's actually a lip on the inside here of this gasket, and the edge of this goes inside there. And 3, you have a little vent valve right here, tiny little vent valve. There's actually a cutout for that on the gasket. So if you follow these 3 steps, you'll make sure it's installed correctly. So kind of slip one edge of the thermostat into the gasket and then just rotate all the way around, making sure that the cutout is right there by the vent valve. Alright, the gasket's seated good, so now we're going to go install it in the vehicle. So when you're installing the new thermostat, you'll note that these 2 nibs here, there's actually a place inside the housing where they line up, and essentially it's going to be facing upwards. That coolant is actually looking real delicious. Alright, like I said, we're going to install it with the 2 nubs facing the back of the vehicle and also facing the top. And you'll actually feel them seat into place with the 2 cutouts in the housing. So now we move the cover back into place and install the 2 bolts. So rotate that bracket out of the way, that's seated on there. And then we just install the 2 bolts. I'm going to use the ratchet on the extension to snug up this left side one. So it's kind of tight back here to do it by hand, so what I did, I got a leaf, I put the bolt and jammed it into the socket. And then that way we have kind of like a longer extension. Now we just feed the bolt in there, get it hand tight. Now the torque for these is 7.4 foot-pounds or 88.8 inch-pounds. I'm just going to get them snug. So just get them snug, give it another 1/8 or 1/4 turn. Alright, that looks good. Now we just position the bracket into place and then use the 2 bolts and just snug those up. You don't have to torque them. Alright, that looks good. Everything's ready to go. We got we didn't take this hose off. We got the bracket installed, the housing installed. Now we just gotta go refill the coolant. Alright, now we're ready to start adding in the new coolant. So grab your coolant. Make sure you only use Honda Type 2 coolant, because Honda cooling systems, they're pretty sensitive. So you want to make sure you use the right stuff. And then just grab a funnel and we'll start filling coolant. I'm using the spill-proof funnel kit. It kind of serves as like an external reservoir, and I'll show you how it's set up here in a second. Okay, so now fully remove the radiator cap, set that aside, and then if you have a funnel, just put it on top here. If you have the spill-proof funnel kit, it was like 20 bucks on Amazon. I'll link it down below. Super useful if you ever work on like cooling systems of your car, different vehicles. Now the difference between this funnel and a regular funnel is this actually has different size attachments for whichever size radiator cap you have, and then that way it'll create like a seal. So any coolant that you pour in here, it can only either go into the radiator or hang out in the top here. That way it's not spilling out over the side. It's not necessary, but it makes the job a lot more clean. Then we take the blue cap, the blue gasket, put them inside and secure it to the radiator just like your regular cap. Alright, now that's snug on there. Now once we have that on there, we just install the funnel, and now we have a leak-proof system from where we pour in the coolant to inside the radiator. Now we got the Honda Type 2 coolant, and we're just gonna pour it in until the radiator is full. Alright, that was 1 gallon. Let's grab a second gallon. Okay, so keep in mind I completely drained the radiator, and it took about 1.3, 1.4 gallons to get it full again. And that's why this kit is pretty cool, because now the extra coolant is just hanging out up top here instead of overflowing. Alright, so now that we've partially filled up the radiator, we have to bleed any remaining air out of the system. So to do that, we're going to start up the vehicle, let it run until that fan, the one furthest to the passenger side, turns on, turns off, and then turns on again. And then at that point, we can remove this and close up the radiator. So let's go start up the car. So you can see how the coolant is bubbling up. That means that air is getting purged out of the system. Alright, so as the car warms up, it's going to accept more and more coolant into the radiator. So you want to make sure you keep either this topped off, or if you just have a regular funnel, make sure you keep adding coolant as necessary. Alright, so now while we're waiting for the air to bleed out, make sure you take the old coolant and just put it in an old bottle, take it to AutoZone or O'Reilly's. They'll recycle it for you for free. Alright, so jumping inside the vehicle, you can see we've reached operating temperature. To get the rest of the coolant cycling through the engine, we're just going to put the heat on and turn it to full blast. And now you can see that the cooling fan is now spinning and it's clicking on and off. So that means we've pretty much fully purged out all the air out of the system. So now we can go back inside, turn off the vehicle. So now if you happen to use one of these things, there'll still be some coolant in there. It comes with a stopper that you can use to plug up the end of it. And then you simply pull off the whole unit, and you can actually use this coolant. So you can see our coolant is now completely full. We can just put the cap back on. Nice. Now we're just going to check the coolant overflow tank, because the engine can suck in coolant from this tank. So we want to make sure it's full between the min and max line. And in doing this process, mine is actually completely empty. So I'm going to have to put in some new coolant into this. So the min and max lines for the coolant overflow tank are actually on the side of the bottle facing the battery. Okay, so you're just going to remove this cap, set this hose to the side. Okay, so we did have some coolant left over, so I'm going to use this coolant to fill up that overflow tank. Okay, now we'll just take the hose, put it back in the bottle, and then screw on the cap.